Hello, everyone. We're going to wait a minute to let people trickle in and then we will get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Novacoast July Critical Vulnerabilities briefing. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so feel free to write any questions in there or in the chat, and I will now be handing it off to Scott.
Thank you, Lily, and welcome all. Thanks for joining the July installment of the Critical Vulnerability Briefing. My name's Scott, and I head up our vulnerability and patch management services here at Novacoast. As always, I like to bore folks who've attended this brief before by outlining objectives. But for any new folks, we do like to differentiate this brief from other fora that are out there for, getting into the weeds on specific vulnerabilities, threat actors who exploit them, TTPs, and, really technical exploitation methodology, and just taking in consideration the now increasingly excessive volume of CVEs, as we'll discuss later, but also the speed with which attackers and AI tooling weaponize exploits against those vulnerabilities. We do like to just brief security practitioners on, hey, what are the worst of the worst? That is to say, at the end of a maintenance cycle, when you're validating remediations by looking at vulnerability scan data, hey, be sure none of these are still persisting in your environment. And when we see them, if there are any trends associated with specific vulnerabilities, products, or protocols they affect, we like to call those out as well. So, quick flashback to last month's brief. If you guys attended, it was I put those top two bullets is exactly what I had in the last installment of this brief, and you'll notice 198 or 206 CVEs addressed by Microsoft, depending on how you're calculating by CNA. That was the largest release in Patch Tuesday history. Just over a week away from the 14th, which was Patch Tuesday this month. I think we all know by now that that number was just blown out of the water. 3 times as many CVEs addressed by Microsoft. The metrics are there. Noticeably, if you're looking back at previous months by breakdown, one note is privilege elevation vulnerabilities really broke away from code execution and sec feature bypass and information disclosure, which weren't too far behind the RCEs. But really, the main focus here is just the sheer volume. So much so that if you guys pulled up Microsoft's update guidance. And you recall, traditionally, they would break that down and individually list out CVEs this month. And I believe they indicated that this will be sort of the new paradigm. Is now they're just breaking those down by affected product group, how many CVEs, fall into that bucket, and how many available patches there are for the CVEs that affect those products. So, and then there was a brief call out to what you see at the bottom of the slide. I believe Microsoft called it, notable vulnerabilities. Essentially, those that rate the title 0 day. In this case, this month we had four, three of which made their way into the CySA catalog due to active exploitation in the wild. One, as we'll see, was publicly disclosed prior to Patch Tuesday. So real quick summary, takeaway table, the three on the top, two SharePoint vulnerabilities, one privilege elevation, another code execution, and then that pretty nasty AD vulnerability all made their way into the CySA. You'll note, and we'll get into this a little further in coming slides, but only one of the SharePoint vulnerabilities was added to CySA upon Patch Tuesday publication, but not too long thereafter, an additional SharePoint vulnerability was added. I think that was just a goof by Microsoft. Probably it was clear that exploitation in the wild existed prior to the 14th, but nonetheless, it's there. Last but not least, the BitLocker sec feature bypass vulnerability. This one was publicly disclosed. It is yet another in the sort of BitLocker vulnerabilities you've seen in the past few months, starting in May, that were identified by Nightmare or Chaotic Eclipse, the disgruntled former Microsoft employee who's kind of been wreaking havoc. But look at this one, a la Yellow Key, Blitzkrieg, just another very similar vulnerability in that series of BitLocker security feature bypasses. Only other takeaway here, a point we often hammer, but it's always worth mentioning, is you could just see by the disparities in the CVSS column, attackers don't really care about a criticality, particularly a theoretical one. They're looking for an access vector. So CVSS, it's an important metric, should never be a guiding light. All right, real quickly, the two SharePoint vulnerabilities, as you could see from the sub bullets, one quickly followed the other in terms of being added to the CySA catalog. Obviously, one is a privilege elevation vulnerability, the other a code execution. But essentially, the exploitation parameters are the same. It's just what is actually being exploited. They're both exploitable over the network without authentication, and neither require any end user interaction. It is fair to say, and I might as well just bring it up on this slide. Hopefully you guys caught this one. It came out a few days ago. CISA did issue an alert. You'll see the two CVEs that we brought up on the previous slide, as well as some additional ones. One going back to April, 3 in July, including the final two that were addressed by the July 2026 cumulative updates. There's another I threw in there because it's cited in the advisory, 55040, not currently under active exploitation, but it is part of the July roll-up. And if you read the advisory from CISA about SharePoint hardening, I would suspect to see this one targeted and most likely exploited very soon. Again, exploitable by a remote unauthenticated attacker. And then I just threw a quick list of, hey, the most common post-exploitation activities once code execution is achieved. Main thing here, though, is the underlying portion. Those of you running SharePoint in the cloud could sleep a little bit easier, but this is really, the advisory is really specific to all versions or all SharePoint server instances on-prem. So 2016, 2019, Enterprise Edition, um, you are all in scope for these and several others. But, if it isn't already, and no need, no intention to insult anyone, I'm sure, if you're running SharePoint on-prem, at this stage of the game, given the trending uh, since late 2025, you're well aware that on-prem SharePoint instances are very much in the crosshairs of bad actors. So, um, give the advisory some attention, give it a quick read, save it off. I threw the reference down below, but if this does apply to you, given your tech stack, uh, pay particular attention to SharePoint updates this month. Do them as timely as possible. Last but not least, those last two 0 days, the AD Federation Services privilege escalation vulnerability, uh, pretty nasty, specifically with regard to follow-on actions. So it is chainable. And even though in the CISA catalog, you guys know they have that field, is it known to be associated with ransomware? It currently says unknown, but I have seen some indications that ransomware is attributed to exploitation of this specific CVE. And then last but not least, as I said, another BitLocker sec feature bypass vulnerability. This one, certainly, given who's releasing these, given the potential impact, uh, give them due attention. But, in the grand scheme of things, bear in mind that just like Yellow Key, just like Blitzkrieg, this one, which to my knowledge doesn't have any sexy, also known as name, but they all require physical access to a machine. So, obviously that requirement a lot harder to exploit. Don't ignore it, but there are certainly other things that should concern you more. I did want to do a quick overview of some of the other vulnerabilities that concern me, and I'm sure a lot of other people. The VM switch privilege elevation vulnerability is pretty darn bad. If you are running Hyper-V, do give that one a look. Another SharePoint vulnerability that had a particularly high, I believe this one of all the SharePoint vulnerabilities in the July cumulative update, this one did have the highest CVSS score, even though I told you not to worry about that. Still going to put it in the high risk category, just given the trending in terms of SharePoint targeting. And this one was a little weird. I'm surprised it's not in the CISA catalog. I'm surprised Microsoft still has it as, I think it's misclassified in the exploitability index, because this one was demonstrated live on stage at Pwn to Own Berlin last month. So there was a functional exploit available prior to Patch Tuesday. I don't have a good answer as to why that didn't rate the title of 0 day. But again, roll that into the really bad SharePoint vulnerability category. Um, RDP, obviously, be very mindful of RDP ports open in your environment, obviously on anything public facing, but certainly um, with respect to lateral movement, this one is pretty easy to exploit. Exchange server, I gave a relatively detailed description in there. It's a cross-site scripting vulnerability. And you'll notice after the semicolon there really is nothing on the end user end. Just simply viewing the message will trigger the exploit. So sort of similar to a lot of, hey, the preview pane is a valid attack vector that we've seen in the past, very similar to that. DHCP servers, obviously anything internet adjacent, be mindful of. but exploitable over the network, no authentication required, and DHCP servers are ripe targets, juicy targets for someone with bad intentions. The race condition bug, a little bit harder to exploit. The network driver code execution bug, but given the potential impact, I threw it on here. And then similarly for the Dynamics NV and Business Central, probably not a big footprint in most organizations, but worthy of mention again, given the potential impact. So just to essentially take this slide as a cheat sheet, mind the CVEs, take a look. Um, if it does affect you or systems in your environment specifically, good justification for expedited patching on those affected systems or groups of systems. All right, I wanted to pivot a little bit. I'm going to rewind. I know these next three slides I just pulled them right from last month's deck. And I wanted to kind of tie a few things together and then pivot a bit on the final slide, just to kind of talk about, what we're seeing on the threat landscape, specifically with regard to just the excessive volume. I know we always call that out. I start every brief articulating that point. Hey, why do we do this? The number of CVEs that we see published month over month steadily increases, and the speed with which attackers, weaponize exploits against those increases as well. Past couple months, we've, with the advent of, people becoming more familiar with Project Glasswing, with Claude Mythos, and its ability to identify 0 days at the cyclic rate, and specifically to, AI generated weaponized exploits against those vulnerabilities. We're not talking about a steady increase in volume of CVEs, but a significant increase. What better time to, or what better way to articulate that than July's Patch Tuesday release, tripling the number of CVEs that were addressed in June, which in and of itself was a quote record-setting release in the history of the Patch Tuesday program. As I said last month, and I'm sure hopefully everyone is aware of BOD 2604, CISA's guidance and recommended SLAs on risk-based prioritization of vulnerability remediation. And they do have, 4 key categories that are down there in the sub-bullets. Hey, is the affected asset internet facing? What's the CISA KEV status? Is it in there or no? And then, hey, can an exploit be automated by an attacker? And probably most importantly, what is the impact? Full control of a system, partial control of a system. Uh, I'm actually working with 2 customers now, operationalizing this guidance, pulling those 2 metrics, the bottom 2, exploit automation and technical impact, pulling from the CISA website. The link to do that is in the actual BOD itself, as those 2 particular metrics they're generally not native. I can't think of a tool actually, like a traditional enterprise vulnerability management tool that has those 2 parameters as sort of filterable criteria. But we're sort of pulling those, aggregating it with other vulnerability and asset characteristics, and then generating some pretty good dashboards. Now, the 2 customers I'm working with, they're not aligning strictly, just due to their operational risk tolerances, with CISA's guidelines and proposed remediation timelines, but they're aligning those with their organizations. One of the things I will say is there are probably other asset characteristics that we want to consider beyond just, hey, is this affected asset internet facing or not? And I'm sure you guys know where we're going with this. Obviously, we want to add some criteria there for, any kind of tier zero, crown jewel, uh, whatever your organization uses as its nomenclature, um, to identify, hey, are these domain controllers? Is it a system hosting a critical business application? That sort of thing. So, obviously there are other critical assets beyond just those that sit on the perimeter of the DMZ. Um, Again, repeat from last month, double repeat if you've already gone over the BOD, but flowchart form, and then table form. And it is a pretty good triage mechanism for, hey, if I can, plug in a CVE and, align it with my vulnerability results and, put it somewhere in this table as to, how concerned should I be and, what should I be prioritizing uh, over other vulnerabilities in my maintenance cycle. All that said, and in the context, like I said, of slide one, why do we do what we do? And, you'll notice the previous slides, kind of what do I say? Like, hey, you don't have to worry too much about the sub bullets. Um, we're focusing on CVEs, and at the end of a maintenance cycle, you really want to make sure that these guys aren't lying around, persisting in your environment because they're pretty bad. All that sort of said, what are we really looking at? And there are simply too many CVEs to be focusing on CVEs in and of themselves. This is not a groundbreaking revelation. Everyone here, should know that. But I did just want to talk a little bit, and this will be a common theme throughout these bullets of not doubting the necessity or the efficacy of vulnerability scanning, but the speed and volume of CVEs. I do think we have to think about, how are we relying on our vulnerability scanning tools? How are we leveraging them? Are we really using them for actionable, intelligence? That is to say, am I sitting around waiting for Tenable or Qualys or Tanium or Rapid7 or what have you, Nucleon, to tell me that all of my Microsoft systems might be missing a patch on or after the second Tuesday of every month? Just one example. No, I probably shouldn't be. And as we all know, depending on the tooling you're using, um, how those data are presented, and how we consume them can be a little different. I'm kind of talking specifically about a lot of times, one CVE doesn't correlate to one distinct finding in your vulnerability data more often than not. One finding will sort of correlate to a specific remediation pathway that will account for sometimes no CVEs at all, sometimes one or maybe 622 in the case of, the July 2026 cumulative update. Um, that said, you know, given if, you know, in light of this month's Patch Tuesday and the number of CVEs addressed there, do a quick retrospective on your commonly deployed browsers, especially Chromium-based browsers. Look at the first version of stable Chrome, stable channel 150 that was released, probably I think 4 versions ago. It addressed 433 CVEs. Um, how do we keep pace if we're just looking at CVEs and really responding to vulnerability summaries or reporting from our scanning tools it's just not going to be good enough. There are so many CVEs that are identified. By the time they're issued a CVE ID, by the time a vendor writes a check for that specific CVE and that new feed is updated in your enterprise vulnerability scanning tool, by the time you scan the entire enterprise and hit get current results for all applicable systems, we're already, at minimum, say 72 hours behind the power curve. And then you could throw in all the traditional caveats like, hey, how accurate are these data? Are they coming from agent-based scans, or are they coming from network scans? If they're coming from the network, what was my authentication success rate? What's my scanning cadence over the network, et cetera, et cetera. So responding to that, given the current climate of the times, is that cumulative number of vulnerabilities in your environment is just going to get bigger and bigger. So really, it, like I said, vulnerability scanning, it's a necessity. Um, there's a ton of utility in it. Uh, I'm consuming those data more and more now as a form of trending and remediation validation, or say looking for outliers. And we can get back to that. Another kind of talking point: how much stock do we put in some of those, vulnerability specific attributes that they normally factor into how we prioritize our remediations? Is it in the CISA-KEV? Does it have a high EPSS score? Does it have a high CVSS score? And several others, some of them proprietary, that take into account those previous two attributes, as well as other attributes that kind of speak more to you know, the ever-changing patterns of the threat landscape. How easy is this to exploit? Is it low complexity? Does it require authentication? Is it associated with ransomware? It goes on and on. Um, well, in the age of AI generated, you know, vulnerability findings and exploit weaponization, whatever is not in the CISA-KEV as we're talking right now could be in there as soon as I finish running my mouth. Um, an EPSS score is just that. It's a really good algorithm for predicting things. Sometimes bad actors can be less predictive than we might think. CVSS scores are theoretical values that, are static, and they reflect how bad uh, a vulnerability could be if it were to be exploited. It's not really factoring in the likelihood of it being exploited, um, or how quickly someone may, leveraging AI or other technologies could generate an exploit. And it also speaks nothing to targeting trends. So, all that said, what can we do? Or where am I sort of leaning, talking with customers and trying to, hey, what can we optimize, or what can we put in place to better position ourselves to be as responsive as we can be, and deal with this volume. Uh, and, for those of you who come often, you've probably heard me say something about cyber hygiene fundamentals. It's always worth, stomping your foot on the basics. So we'll say it again. And basically the theme here is, focus less on CVEs, focus more on solutions. Um, OS patches. Apply any and all OS patches, whether they're security related or functional updates, uh, as quickly as you possibly can within your organizational risk threshold. Um, I know, easier said than done, but, you know, if we're to expect, you know, one Microsoft cumulative update to cover, you know, approximately 600 CVEs, sometimes less, perhaps more on any given month. Multiply that by the number of Windows systems in your ecosystem, and, the speed with which you can reduce that attack surface, and consequently reduce the cumulative number of CVEs you see in your vulnerability scan results. is only going to be a benefit. Updating out-of-date software. Um, Again, any vendor that's part of Project Glasswing, I know I always pick on Chrome, Edge, Chromium-based browsers just because they're an easy example of, I probably used to kid in the past that in any given month, Chrome's going to come out with or Google's going to come out with 4 versions of Chrome. Never have we seen the number of vulnerabilities per version addressed as we have in the past few months. Same thing with other vendors. The advisories are coming out more frequently and they're addressing more flaws as they're discovered with greater speed. Anything that you can do to automate updating commonly deployed applications across your enterprise, specifically those that, really the only impact would be an inconvenience to the end user. Look for those strategies, talk about them, employ them. If an end user has to, close and relaunch their Chrome browser, I think that's a trade-off I'm willing to make if it means, closing the loop on 433 CVEs times, every Chrome installation that I have in my organization. Um, and then addressing misconfigurations, specifically those, with the biggest footprint. I know, it's not as easy as pushing a patch or updating an application from a tooling perspective. A lot of, we might have to think about it a little more, might require a reg key change, depending on the tooling you're using. It might require building a package or creating a GPO, but I can't think of very few customer environments have I ever been in where you don't open their vulnerability findings and see just a inexcusable amount of speculative execution side channel attack vulnerabilities or win verify trust, things like that, where triple des ciphers, things with, simple registry modifications, we can clear those from the chessboard and reduce the attack surface. The greater speed that we can execute those fundamental cyber hygiene actions and do them consistently, without being reckless. Uh, I get it. Everyone's got a business to run. Uh, we're not professional security organizations, but do so. And I just realized I'm like 3 minutes over time. Um, Maybe we'll push this to last week, but the last thing that I'll say, trying to be mindful of time, uh, please do ask questions and provide feedback. What are you guys doing? What's the level of panic in your C-suite? I know most people that I talk to with C in their title, depending on how engaged or not, those who are less engaged in the day-to-day vulnerability patch management weeds, all they see is like, why did my number of cumulative vulnerabilities like double this month? The answer is simple. The response, what are we going to do about it, moving forward, is a little trickier. So I think this is a pretty worthwhile ongoing conversation. Hopefully some of you agree. And if you want to continue that, feel free to reach out or join next month and maybe we can continue on that front. If you guys are interested in strategies or what I'm seeing, customers of mine doing, that sort of thing. Um, with that, I do thank you guys. I apologize for running over, but hope to see you next month. And I will hand it back to Lily.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to send them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll wait 1 second to see if any come through. Okay, I'm not seeing any yet. If any are still coming through, I will save them and save who they're from and make sure that our team gets those. Thank you again, everyone. Our team will also be sending out these slides and the recordings soon. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.